So, standard reminders, money's point due this weekend. So, same as concept check due this weekend. If we don't get through all of today's content, I probably will bump this by at least a couple of days. And likewise, the mini project is due next weekend. And if we bump this one, I might bump this one as well. Though I already saw at least one person's already submitted their mini project, so I go for initiative, I guess. Well, you should have everything you need for the mini project after we get through this content. So, any questions? Okay. All right, so from last time, remember we talked about the basic algorithm structure for the GA. So this is just the same stuff that we had from last time. We start from a random initial population. It could be random, but you can also warm start a genetic algorithm or any evolutionary based algorithm where you can say, here's a population that I think is nearby, or it's like a place that I want you to prioritize your search. You can start with that population or make it totally random and just say, here's my feasible set, draw randomly from there. Then from there, you can calculate trait values. So those are the things that matter to you for now. This is probably only a one trait that you, or one character that you care about. So there's probably just one function that you're evaluating relative to for each one of that are in your population. And those are the things you're optimizing for. But as you get to multi-objective, you might be calculating multiple characters. So you might be calculating the cost of something, the speed of something. You might be calculating loss for one set of objects and then loss for another set of objects, or you're building classifiers or something. There's a bunch of things you could be calculating. We're going to be talking about evolutionary programming in the next unit, and you might be talking about, well, I want to make sure that my program is correct. So there's some sort of loss function that captures correctness. But you might also want to say, but how do I do it in the most energy efficient way? So people like Stephanie Forrest have looked at the energy consumption of code. And so you can refactor code so that at least at some measurable scale, you actually can notice that although these two code fragments do exactly the same thing, this one uses slightly less energy in how it's implemented. And if that goes into scale, then you can really start saving things. And so Gesundheit, you might have those sorts of multiple objectives. For now, we're just worrying about that one objective. After you've calculated all those things, then you can say, have I found a good enough solutions, or have I run for long enough? And if you have, you can exit then, that's your termination. Assuming that you didn't, then you scale those values to turn them into fitness values. And so these scaled fitness values, some authors call them expectations, because they're sort of like an expected number of offspring if this was a natural system. So the idea here is that the scale of your character values might not be exactly what you want to drive the population dynamics. Like it might qualitatively be correct, like it might sort them in the right order, but you might want to say that if there's really giant differences in your objective values, you may not want giant differences in how the population changes. And so we're going to be talking about not only scaled fitness, the way you scale fitness here to control for that selective pressure, but we're going to find selection operators will also help you with this. But to preload the selection operators, you can create scaled fitness functions, which might compress different regions of your optimization objective to better manage the dynamics of the system. So your system doesn't run away with an early potential candidate and not ever find later ones that are even better. And then so after you have those fitness values, then you're going to go through selection. So this is modeling natural selection. So this is this idea that there are certain individuals whose traits give them an advantage in the environment. And so those should end up having more offspring or more parents able to produce offspring. And that's what the selection operator models, is it will make sure that those that have higher fitness will have more reproductive opportunities. And then after you've selected your parents, you now produce the offspring. And so that process is really a two-stage process. I've broken it up here. And so I've bundled all this crossover all under select offspring, but you could argue that this other thing I'm about to uncover is also part of it. But the idea here is once you've selected the parents that are the highest fitness candidates, then from those parents, you produce offspring that are versions of those parents, that are in the neighborhood of those parents in some way, that is defined by crossover, which is sexual recombination. So you grab two parents and you swap features of them to produce new ones, which are, they didn't change the distribution of the traits, of the alleles, I should say, but they've now assorted them in a different way that might give rise to different traits. So that's what crossover will do, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and then mutation. So once you have those offspring, then a question is, do we need to modify them a little bit randomly so that they kind of search around the parents? So this is kind of so there's the things they directly inherit, and then there's the innovations that happen randomly that get added to that. And that's the mutation. And that's how you form your next population, and that will then iterate, and that is the basic genetic algorithm. The one thing that's sort of unnatural is that we're also going to select elites. And so as we're searching through the space, if we find really good candidates, in nature, there's always a chance that they'll just randomly get lost. So there might be, if there's a population of 100 individuals, a new innovation comes up in one or two individuals, and before those two individuals have an opportunity to reproduce and spread that through the population, they get hit by, they get hit by an asteroid or a meteor, or they get hit by a wildfire, whatever those. So in nature, there's all this random chance. And there will be in our selection operators we'll talk about today, probability. So even though you have high fitness, there's still a chance that if you have a low numbers in the population, you won't get selected to be a parent. There's a chance of that. And that models this idea of genetic drift. So in natural systems, this happens all the time, and really good solutions may just not make it just due to bad luck. But because we're designing this, and we have the ability to compare across everybody that's out there, we can store elites. So those that are really good, we can make sure that there is a subset of our population that we just directly pass down those that are our top fitness candidates, and we never lose them. And that is a hack that we do in order to prevent the drift, accidentally losing top quality solutions. And so that I'm going to bundle in with our selection operator. So today we're sort of wrapping up this genetic algorithm by defining these three operators. So every GA is going to look a little bit like this. I've shown it in the unit on Canvas under Unit 1 that I talk about. I've got a couple links to different chapters for different authors' presentations of different GA formulations. And they do vary, and that's why I've presented them to show you those variances. They generally have this structure, and they can differ in how they structure the population, as we'll see, and they can differ in the different types of operators they add that meet the spirit of these three operators. But generally speaking, they all run about the same way. So I've linked to those. I've also linked to MATLAB's genetic algorithm, just as a standard commercially available genetic algorithm. And I'm going to contrast and compare between one of those book GAs and MATLAB's GA, just to show you the type of variance you might see. So that was from last time. Any questions about this general structure of the GA? Okay. All right. So like I said, so the one of the GAs that I selected from a textbook, it's like the second link in the resources for Unit 1, that chapter on the GA, that one organizes its population like this. So it creates a vector. It actually imagines genes as floating point numbers. So its population is a matrix where every row is an individual and every column is a gene. So you have this matrix of n rows by n columns, and that's how you store it internally. You could come up with lots of other data structures that might be convenient to use. But the way they structure the population is they have this R hyperparameter, that's our number of parents, and M is our total population size. So they say that we've got R parents in the population and M minus R offspring. So every iteration through that loop, we're going to look at the previous population and build the next population. The way we're going to build it is we're going to select our R parents, and then from those R parents that we select, we're going to use them to breed. So we're going to have those parents mate, and then we're going to mutate the offspring, and that will fill out the other M minus R offspring. So these are like high fitness clones of the parents or of the previous generation, and these here are mutated and recombined offspring of those parents. And that's how they do it. That's how this population structure. So you can think of this as asexual clonal reproduction and sexual reproduction with mutation, with slight variation. So when we present the selection operator is selecting this section of parents that will go into the next generation. That's going to be slightly different from how MATLAB does it, which is on the other side of this page here. The selection operator will be probabilistic. So these are not the top R fitness values. And so what basically is going to happen is we're going to see in all of the three selection operators we look at, it's going to be a probabilistic selection of R parents, not OUR, but R parents, that is where the probabilities are related to the fitness values. But when we draw a parent from the set in the previous population, we draw it with replacement. So we can get, for one thing, because it's a probabilistic draw, a high fitness individual may not actually be selected. It just could be bad luck. And a low fitness individual will sometimes be selected. If you're throwing darts at a dartboard, sometimes you hit the bullseye, despite it being a very, very small error, very, very small area. And that's the same thing here. So there's randomness there, and you can get duplication. So you can have a high fitness individual in the previous population, and because they're so high fitness, that they might be selected multiple times. So they might only exist once in the previous population, but they might actually become 5 parents in the new population. So we're drawing with replacement. So there is a major benefit in terms of reproduction to be high fitness. So we talk about in biology, fitness is after offspring. You see how many offspring in biological organisms have, and then you fit a statistical model of fitness to help describe how the alleles in the previous generation led to a change in the alleles in the next generation. So you count the offspring and then fit the fitness. Here we flip it, where fitness is sort of the expected reproduction, we think is going to happen. And then we use probabilistic selection functions to then generate offspring that are consistent with that. So, in a genetic algorithm, we're kind of offspring second, and in biology, we're sort of offspring first. The net effect is the same, but it's a very different mechanism. So I'm not implying that biology has a fitness function. We have a fitness description of biological phenomenon. Here, the fitness is actually driving the reproduction. Okay, so we're going to go over 3 selection operators. After we talk about the selection operators, then we have to talk about, well, once you have these R parents, how do you breed them to produce these different combinations of offspring? And that's the so-called crossover operator. And this implements an algorithmic version of sex. So you'll bring 2 parents together and you'll produce 2 offspring. Those 2 offspring will be kind of a deterministic recombination of alleles, so gene variants that were in those 2 parents. After you cross over in this algorithm, you mutate the remaining offspring. So those offspring that were created, you're going to go to their genes and you're going to perturb some genes probabilistically So you might add, well, we'll see the sort of two major ways to do mutation. So you can imagine you add a little bit of noise to the gene variants, and that's going to make them differ from their parents. And then in this algorithm that from this book chapter, they don't have elites, but they have something close to elites, and that the parents are high fitness. They're drawn from a selection operator based on fitness. And so if you have high fitness, you're very likely to be in this group. And we do not mutate the parents in this algorithm, in this version of the GA. So they're almost elites. Now, there's no guarantee that even if you're high fitness, that you're going to be selected into this population, but it's very likely that you'll be selected into this population. Once you're in this R population, this slice here, then you don't mutate. So you're carried on directly to the next generation untouched. So that's how they emulate elites without actually having elites. So this would be like a biological population where if you got the privilege to reproduce, you also were granted the privilege to live as long as your offspring and you live alongside them or something like that. So it's a little weird like that. Or like I say, it's like asexual reproduction without mutation. All right, so that is the high level view of the algorithm from the book. And then I'm going to show you now the way MATLAB does it, which is slightly different. But with the selection crossover mutation operators, that they can be applied in both algorithms. So exactly the same way. So these are modules that can be plugged in to pretty much any GA, regardless of how the outer structure is set up. Any questions about this setup? Yeah.
Would the high fitness clones give a high selective pressure then?
The selective pressure is determined by, so selective pressure describes how sensitive the population to population changes are to high fitness individuals. So if we have high fitness, well, I say high fitness clones, I should have said highest fitness clones or something like that, or clones that have a high enough fitness that they were selected. So the selection operator and the fitness scaling will change the likelihood that a very good quality individual will get into the parent. If you have a fitness scaling function that maintains huge differences in the function and the objective characters, the optimization objective, and you just let it, let that be the case, then if you have a couple of individuals that just happen to be way better than all of the other individuals in the population, they're the only ones that will get into the parent because their fitness will just dominate everybody else's fitness. And that would be a case of high selective pressure. And if they're the only ones in the parent pool, then they're the only ones who have offspring. So the next population won't look at all like some of these others that had a poor version of that optimization objective. But if we instead had fitness scaling that compressed those, and if we had selection operators that had very low selective pressure, then even though some of these were a much worse function objective, optimization objective, there's still a good chance that they'll have some representation in the parent breeding. And so they'll then be maintained in the next generation. Yep.
Is this like before the down selection back to the original population?
So that's a great question. So I had mentioned conceptually when we were talking about population genetics, we sort of separated out reproduction and limitation. So we talked about you first kind of take an initial population, you grow it into a bigger population, and then you bring it back down. What we're doing is we're bundling all of that up into the selection operator. So we don't actually create more individuals and then find them, bring them down. What we do is model that if you're an individual with fitness, 4, given all the other fitnesses, if we were to go through the process of letting you reproduce and then sampling you back down, what's the probability that you would make it through? And that modeling of that probability of you making it, we're just going to fit that right into the selection operator.
How do the clones work with this?
Well, so the idea, a clone is just is an individual that is passed to the next population without mutation and without being touched by crossover. So if I have, a bunch of individuals here, the idea here, if this is my population, then I can say for the next population, I need to populate that population. So one of the things I can do is I can just take these three and copy them directly into this next population without any changes. That's what I mean by clones. Now, I might say, well, those are in the breeding pool. I'm going to then have some of those mate and then mutate them. And then I'll get different versions of their offspring that look slightly different from their parents. That's what I mean, those wouldn't be clones. So that's basically what this algorithm does, is it, based on fitness, it decides who's going to get into the breeding pool. And then it copies them. After you've selected the breeding pool randomly, who's going to be involved, where you're biased towards high fitness, then those high fitness individuals in the breeding pool, and this will become clear when we talk about the selection operators, those are copied directly. So those are the asexual clones. And then those in the breeding pool get an opportunity to mate, their offspring mutate, and then those slightly different, these offspring here, these are going to be combinations of alleles from parents in the breeding pool that are then perturbed by noise to produce slight variations. So hopefully innovative new candidates for us to try. Yeah.
So using that, we are not actually increasing the population. We are just taking the probability out of it.
Right.
So how are we getting new candidates if the actual population is not getting increased, or new thing is not actually?
Well, so you can think of it, so remember the previous population is size n. So this was from the previous generation. That we're only selecting R parents where R is less than n. So that is sort of where the restrictions happen. So it's this idea that we always have M in our population, but only sort of, I'm gonna say top R, but remember it's probabilistic. But it's like the top R candidates where R is less than N. So the top R candidates are these ones here, which is a smaller population than the original. So that gives us room to fill. So we're going to take the other slots in that array and create new individuals based on the previous individuals. And that's where hopefully innovation happens. Yeah.
So what is the reason for taking a probabilistic selection operator? Like there must be more optimal ones as well, right?
Well, what do you mean by more optimal? Like and maybe this will become clear once we get into this, but what would be the alternative? You say deterministic, you just take the top R?
Like a function where the PDF is a function of the fitness function.
That's exactly, but that's what these selection operators will be. So I say probabilistic, I don't mean it's uniformly random, but the probability of selecting the individuals is going to be biased by their fitness. So if you have high fitness, like if you have really high fitness, there might be 100% chance that I pick you to become a parent. Now, with probability 0, you might not be, but that still could happen. I just can't describe it probabilistically. So you're probably going to get in there, but not only are you probably going to get in there, but because I select you with replacement, even if there's only one of you in this generation, there might be 6 of you in that generation. So if you have a really, really high relative fitness, then you suddenly get lots of copies of yourself here, which means that you and your descendants are going to dominate the next generation. And so the probability allows us to, it allows us to have some chance of keeping low fitness individuals that may someday evolve into higher fitness individuals in the population. And then it also allows us to realize this idea of fitness leading to more offspring. That's why we don't just take the top R. This changes the multiplicity of those high fitness individuals. And I think this will become clear when we talk about the 3 major selection operators. All right, so let's contrast that. If you were to go in, you can go into MATLAB and just type GA, and you can pass it a function and not know anything about this. You pass it a function and some minimal options, some constraints, And it will pop out the minimal value of that function, or the maximum value, depending on how you have it configured, and it's behind the scenes running a GA. How does its GA work? And so in the MATLAB case, it structures its population very different. So it has M individuals, just like before. So this is an M-sized population, but it's divided up differently, and it involves elites. So it reserves E individuals. So this is a hyperparameter you can put into MATLAB and tell it how many elites you want. And it reserves E slots of the population for the top E elites. These are not selected probabilistically. As we'll see, it's like, this is like when the new population is generated, it sorts them all by fitness, and it just takes those top E individuals, so those highest fitness individuals, and just copies them directly into the next population. No selection operator, it's just pure copying those top E into that next population. And then it has M minus E left over. So there's this size here is M minus E. So that's how many slots it has left over to do something that looks like this old algorithm or this other algorithm. So what does it do with those? Well, there is a fraction of those, which was called the crossover fraction, that it's going to apply crossover to. Now, who is it crossing over? Well, up here, it's selected R parents, but those R parents are an intermediate set. So from the old population, it's selected R individuals based on their fitness to have an opportunity to source the genetic material for these M minus E slots. Those R parents are not a direct part of the next population, but they are the breeders that can give rise to offspring that are in the next population. So you look at the previous population, you take the top E individuals and you save them. They're going to be copied right into the next generation. They're the clones. And then you look at the whole population, and from there you select R individuals probabilistically with the selection operator. And then those R individuals, those just sit in an intermediate breeding pool that'll be discarded at the end of this iteration. But we use those R individuals to generate the M minus E times a fraction, which is a hyperparameter you tell MATLAB, of how many of this remaining slots you want to be from crossover. And they end up using the crossover operator to take two parents and produce two offspring to fill up some of these slots. And then the last section of that, the mutation fraction, is these are asexually produced offspring that have variation from mutation. So for the remaining slots that are left over, then you randomly select individuals from the R parents and mutate them randomly, and they fill up the last remaining slots. So you end up getting now a set of individuals that is immune from losses due to drift. So high fitness individuals will never accidentally get lost because you had a bad luck in the way you were doing your selection operator. And then the crossover mutation uses the same logic as it's going on over here. But then MATLAB also has hyperparameters that we're not going to get into yet until we get into unit, or I think unit 3, maybe unit 4 on distributed approaches, because it also allows you to parallelize these things, either in an abstract sense on one CPU or across CPUs, so that you can have independent GAs running that periodically have individuals that migrate from one population to another. And it turns out that changed the dynamics of the GA, which we'll talk about in a future unit. So I'm just mentioning it here that that's another thing that has been built into this commercial GA and is available for you to configure. So it's a very different population structure, but we'll use the same selection operator, the same crossover operator, and the same mutation operators. And these are function callbacks in any commercial GA, any API you download for Python, any tool like MATLAB or whatever. They're going to allow you to write your own selection operator, crossover operator, mutation operator, and pass it in as a function handler, or use their own. So these are modules which you can tune based on your application. All right, so questions about this structure. It's very similar. The biggest addition is they've added these elites, and their parent pool is now not part of the next generation. They're sit in an intermediate group where they eventually will get thrown out at the end of the iteration, but then they source pure crossover and pure mutation. So that's another thing I want to highlight. In MATLAB, if you're a crossover offspring, you don't get mutated. So they separate out crossover mutation as opposed to in the book one here, they combine. Yep.
Just to be clear, what is PC?
PC is the fraction, so this is what's called the crossover fraction. So so PC, and we'll bring up all these hyperparameters as we need them in a moment. But PC, I'll just mention is 0 to 1. So it is a fraction. So I'll call it the crossover fraction. And it is the proportion or the fraction of the m minus e slots left over that are filled with offspring that are the product of crossover. And 1 minus PC will be the mutation fraction, which is the fraction of the m minus e offspring left over, which are populated by mutation. That's how MATLAB does it. So in MATLAB, it has defaults for these things, but you can go in and change it. You can say, I want a population of 1,000 individuals, I want 30 elites, and I want there to be mostly mutation. So maybe I'll set my crossover fraction to 25%. So the rest mostly are mutated and only a few are crossed over. So we of course need to have an intuition as to what the different, like how these different operators work, and why would you want a high crossover fraction or a low crossover fraction, and so on. So we'll get that. Okay, any other questions about the general structure of this population? So just showing you, if somebody says I'm using a genetic algorithm, there's different, the details might be slightly different. And so if the details matter to you, then you have to ask more questions. But so with the general flavor of the genetic algorithm, you have these 3 operators, which are applied in roughly the order that I talked about on the previous slide. But down in the devil is in the details, you can apply them simultaneously, you can apply them separately, and there might be implementation reasons, there might be optimization efficiency reasons that you separate things out. It might just be, I think in the case of MATLAB, because this is a general purpose tool they wanted lots of people to use and be able to use in lots of different ways, I think they wanted to choose the most flexible, modular way that they could, if anybody wanted to change certain aspects of the GA, their one GA could be reconfigured to act like lots of other GAs. And I think that's the reason why they organize it this way. Whereas in the textbook case, they were just looking for a teaching example, and they thought this captured a lot of the aspects of most GAs without necessarily being as flexible.
To combine crossover with mutation, just using MATLAB or
you can if you build your own crossover operator. So the default crossover operator has no mutation. They separate it out. And now if somebody really wants their offspring that are crossover to be mutated, you could build your own crossover operator that uses their default one and then adds on mutation at the end. And that would be a way to do it. But the nice thing about this is you can tune the mutation probability with one parameter in MATLAB. You don't have to pass it a whole function. So they're saying, if you know you want mutation and you're okay with mutation only applying to the asexual ones, then you can just change one parameter. But if you really need the crossover to be mutated, you got to pass a whole function handle. So you have to write your own little wrapper, which maybe does normal crossover and then adds mutation. And that's just a little less convenient. Okay, all right, so let's get into some of the details here. Selection operator. Very important. It's the thing that implements our version of natural selection or artificial selection. So if, this is just a reminder of what I already drew out 2 slides ago, the general structure here. And we said that after you calculate the scale fitness, you go through this selection section here. And that's all I'm saying down here. So regardless of how you do it, MATLAB or the other one, you look at the population coming in and their scaled fitness values, and you apply the selection operator to select those R parents with replacement, and that would allow for duplicates in the breeding pool, and these are inputs to crossover a mutation that come downstream. Now, if you have elitism, so that's the term there. So whenever somebody says they apply an evolutionary algorithm, a question you should ask is, do you use elitism? And people in this community will know what you mean. So you can have an algorithm, the book algorithm, when they'd say, no, we don't have elitism in this algorithm, but we have these top parents are not mutated. So that's how we get close to that. In MATLAB, they'd say, yes, we do have elitism. So if you have elitism, then the top E individuals in the whole population, so the incoming population, these are not the top E individuals after you produce the offspring. This is before you produce the offspring. You look at the incoming population, so the offspring that were generated in the previous iteration, and you sort them by fitness, and you take the top E individuals and you save them in your group of elites, wherever you've chosen to store those. So that happens at the same level too. So at the same level, we're choosing our parents, we're choosing our elites. They're kind of independent processes, although they're both based on fitness. So now we want to look at exactly how, this is just sorting and choosing. The selection operator, there's lots of different ways we can build that. We're going to talk about the three major ones. All right, so let me move on. If there's questions about this, then we can come back to it. But I think some of the questions might be resolved when we start looking at the selection operator. So the oldest, sort of the most, most well-known selection operator is the so-called fitness proportionate selection or roulette wheel selection. And so in fitness proportionate selection, you've got this incoming population where every individual has a scaled fitness. So MATLAB calls the scaled fitness expectations, but that's what this F is here, the scaled fitness. And we need to construct a probability of being selected as a parent that is proportional to, so that's the little proportional to symbol, the fitness. And we're going to do that in about the simplest way possible. And this is the reason why classically the GA requires non-negative fitness functions, because of this. So we construct the probability of being selected as a parent as the fitness of that individual divided by the sum of all the fitnesses of all the individuals. And that then guarantees that all of these things add up to 1. And so we can use a roulette wheel approach where we're going to draw basically, so you can imagine laying these all out on a line. And so the P1 is going to take up a certain amount of room, P2, and so on and so forth. When you stack them on top of each other and call this 0, then they're going to add up to 1. So the sums of all of them equal to 1. And if you threw a dart at this board here, then you would hit one of these intervals. And so if you throw a dart and you hit this interval, then you're going to say parent M gets selected for the population, or gets selected to be a parent. If your dart landed here, the individual 3 gets selected to be a parent. And you just keep throwing this dart over and over again. And so the probability that you are selected as a parent is proportional to the area that you take up on this linear dartboard. That's so-called roulette wheel selection. So in the roulette wheel, you can imagine different areas and you're dropping a ball. And if it happens to land in a particular area, then that number is selected. And this is just a linear version of that. So roulette wheel selection is the term we use for that. So that's all I'm summarizing here. Draw a random number from 0 to 1 and use that random number to pick a parent. Repeat that R times to fill out all of your R slots, allowing for duplication. So that's what we mean by draw with replacement. That's fitness proportional selection. This can generate very high selective pressure, because if you happen to have a fitness that is many orders of magnitude greater than all the other fitnesses, then your probability here is probably going to be close to 1. And so even though you're one individual out of 1,000, because your fitness is so gigantic then the next population is not going to include any of those 999. So you can have very high selective pressure. If you don't want that selective pressure, your only option is, in this algorithm, is to use a scaling function, which calms that down. So this is one of the major reasons we have fitness scaling. The other two selection operators directly allow us to adjust selective pressure in the operator, but this one doesn't. Now you could say, well, Ted, can I like add an exponent up here, like, make this like f squared, divided by, the sums of f squared? Wouldn't that have a similar effect? And that's exactly what fitness scaling does. So really, fitness scaling is for fitness proportionate selection. Questions? Yeah.
You said that it requires it to be 0. Could you just apply like a softmax?
That would also be kind of an example of fitness scaling. So the question was, could we use softmax? So could we use a logistic map, an S-shaped map, which maps anything from -infinity to 0 to 1, in a way that, if you're familiar with softmax, and when we get to thermodynamics, we'll talk about softmax and how softmax came from thermodynamics. But so we haven't got there yet, but that's coming. But functions like that can be used, and they would be used here in the fitness scale. Does that make sense? Good.
This is for the book example of GA, right?
This is for both of them. So either one of those can use this selection operator, because both of them require you to draw R parents. The book example just puts the R parents in the next population. The MATLAB example holds them in an intermediate zone to use them to generate the offspring in a different way. But they both need those R parents. How do we get those R parents? This is one way to do that, fitness proportionate selection. That makes sense? There are two other ways that we can do it. All right, so big problem people have with this. It's very intuitive. It fits a lot of other things people do, and so it kind of makes sense. It seems computationally easy to compute, but it has this high selective pressure that requires you to use sophisticated scaling. And how do you do that scaling? And then those scaling, that adds a whole new set of weird hyperparameters in those scaling functions. Like if you use softmax, then there might be a temperature component that that's a temperature parameter that you put into softmax. And you're like, well, so how do I set that temperature? So it's not as intuitive. So they said, well, let's consider, so we have this problem. I'm on the executive committee for the dean. And so one of the things we do every year is we rank candidates for the Dean's Dissertation Award for the PhD. And we have to deal with this in that, we have multiple people on the committee. We're going to score them in different ways. My scores on average across me might be different than the committee member next to me's scores. So we have different average scores. So there's all these different things that make it hard for us to then come up with a ranking across the table. And so one of the things that we can do is replace our absolute scores with ranks and then try to do math on those ranks. And we find that makes for much more robust ways to sort students out. So we had effectively the selective pressure problem in that some people's sort of fitness function would maybe like propel one student way above another's in terms of their scores. But then the problem was that would allow us to pick the first ranked student, and we all would agree, this student definitely is up there, but we have to award like 8 of these awards. So then how do we sort out the next, 2 to 8 or 2 to 6 or whatever the number is? And we were losing discriminability for the lower ranked students. And so this was a problem of selective pressure. So I actually suggested that we use some of the lessons that I've learned in building genetic algorithms in order to update how we do our ranking. And now we find that we get much more robust scoring of the lower ranked individuals. So we don't get like, if somebody happened to change their scoring slightly in absolute terms, that suddenly our second and thirds flip or something like that. And so that was, that kind of similar thoughts went into designing our ranking selection in the GA. So rank selection here is you basically rank all of your individuals by their fitness and then do fitness proportionate selection on their ranks. Let me just show you what that looks like. So we're going to construct a new fitness function that basically makes it so that the best individual with the original function, they're going to get a top fitness, which is a hyperparameter we call Fmax. The second best individual gets Fmax minus some hyperparameter called Z. The third individual, Fmax minus 2Z, and so on. So it's basically Fmax minus Z times their rank minus 1. So if they have a rank of 1, then they just get Fmax. If they have a rank of 2, they get Fmax minus Z, 3, Fmax minus 2Z, and so on. So that gives us this new fitness here, which then we can then do fitness proportionate selection on those fitnesses. So we do the roulette wheel selection based on that. And it's basically a roulette wheel selection based on rank. And what's fun about this is that Fmax, which really just needs to be set high enough that this new fitness function is always non-negative, and Z are now hyperparameters allow us to adjust selective pressure directly in the selection operator in a little bit more intuitive way. So basically Z, like this is like a comb of individuals that were all spaced by Z. And so as you make Z larger, you separate out individuals. As you make Z smaller, you bring them in closer together. So if you choose a very large Z, you'll have high selective pressure. And so those individuals that are top ranked are going to dominate more of the parent pool. But if you make Z smaller, you give those individuals lower in the rank more opportunities to show up in the parent pool. So we can directly adjust selective pressure right in the selection operator. So that's kind of nice. But again, there's randomness that can lead to good luck and bad luck. So, basically, whenever I talk about selective pressure, I am implicitly talking about drift. I'm implicitly talking about bad luck and good luck. So selective pressure, the more selective pressure you have, the less drift, the less luck. The lower selective pressure, the more luck you introduce, the more opportunity for low-ranked individuals to show up in the pool, the more opportunity for high-ranked individuals to not. So that's ranking selection. Does that make sense? We just create a new fitness function based on their ranks, and then we do roulette wheel on that new fitness function. And by roulette wheel, I mean what we did on the previous slide, just with this redefined fitness. Okay, so that has a lot lower or potentially lower selective pressure than pure roulette wheel selection. Then the third way we do selection is tournament selection. And this has the biggest range of selective pressure. You can basically crank this thing all the way down to almost no selective pressure where we've got all randomness, and then you can crank it all the way up to like the highest selective pressure you could possibly get, where it's almost deterministic, where you just always choose the top individual. So the idea behind tournament selection is that we're going to create our contests, like, basically our matches among Y, or that's a hyperparameter, contestants that are randomly drawn from our pool of candidates. And in each one of those contests, all we do is take the top ranked individual deterministically. So it's random selection into the contests. And in the size of the contest is a hyperparameter. But who wins the contest is deterministic. So that's tournament selection. Randomly draw Y candidates, Y genotypes from our M population. In that group of Y, pick the best, deterministically, the absolute best, not probabilistically. Whoever is at the top in terms of fitness, they win that contest, and repeat until you populate all of your R individuals. So the idea here is that Y is a hyperparameter, which allows us to adjust selective pressure. If you set Y equal to 2, which is the common choice, you have very low selective pressure. Why is that the case? Why is that the case? It's because if you're randomly selecting pairs from the population, you may miss the highest fitness individual. Like it might be that you've got 100 candidates that all have different fitnesses, and the best fitness is this one candidate over here. But because you're uniformly selecting these pairs, no matter how they're holding up their hand, they're saying, pick me, pick me, pick me. So you have this pick me boy over here who doesn't ever get picked. And instead, these low fitness individuals, they duke it out. So you got these two low fitness individuals, you pick the highest. These two you pick the highest. So in order to reliably get picked by tournament selection with a low Y, you not only have to be high fitness, but you have to sort of be, there have to be enough of you in the population to make it likely that you're even selected for a contest to begin with. Every contest you're picked for, you'll win, but you may not be picked for many contests. So it's very low selective pressure. But then let's contrast that. Let's set Y equal to M. Here it's the highest selective pressure, because now if you have the highest fitness in the population, you're guaranteed to win. You're guaranteed to be picked for every contest and to win every contest. So you will now populate R clones of the single highest individual. So you can go from really low to really high selective pressure with this operator. And just like in the previous one, so in both this one and the previous one, the incoming fitnesses don't have to be positive. They can be negative because they're both effectively based on ranking. Question?
So, for MATLAB's case, it's combined some of these selection operators into this much goes for tournament selection, this much goes for.
No. So you get to choose which one selection operator you want. So
This just seems like the elite, top E elites from the MATLAB, where Y equals to M, and then we're choosing the first form.
if you were to choose tournament selection with MATLAB and set this parameter equal to the population size, then that would end up being redundant. Because it would end up getting is you get the top E elites, and then the R parents would all look like the top individual who was already in the elites. And then those R parents would get crossed over, which we haven't talked about yet. And it turns out that if two individuals are identical and get crossed over, they produce identical offspring. So all of the crossover offspring would end up looking like that one top individual. And then the mutated ones would all look like slight perturbations of that top individual. So you get some diversity in the elites, and then you get all of the M minus E individuals would look a lot like that one top individual. So you probably would have said, this is not a very exploratory, this is very greedy. So it's like an extreme that nobody chooses. Like I said, most of the time when you choose tournament selection, you're doing it because you want a very exploration biased algorithm. And you would usually choose something like Y equals 2, or you might make it a little bit bigger, but it would not be a large fraction of the population. Because you already have elites. And this isn't really a good replacement for elites because it only maintains one of them, so it really hurts your diversity. Because that's what high selective pressure means. It's going to be a rapid decline in diversity, high selective pressure. Good.
After a contest, for the genotypes that don't get picked, do they go back to the draw?
Yeah, you can think of it that way, because you're randomly drawing Y candidates from a population, and I guess I should say, with replacement, if that helps. So with replacement. So if you got selected for a contest, you might get selected again. Other questions? So these are just 3 different approaches that people use to do selection operators. I can't tell you one's better than the other. I can tell you that if some people just have their personal favorites. Ranking selection and tournament selection are a little more sophisticated than proportionate selection because you have this parameter that allows you to adjust that. But I think a lot of people who use the GA for the first time, who don't take classes like this and all that fitness proportion selection, it makes more immediate sense, and there's not the worry about the selective pressure. So I would say fitness proportion selection still dominates, like it's usually the default. But if you are noticing that your GA keeps getting stuck in local optima, it doesn't seem to be, you're like, I know there's got to be a better solution, and you're just getting distracted by this local optima, then these selection operators allow you, without cranking up mutation, allow you to maintain diversity and be a little more exploratory. Yep.
You ever like change the type of selection operator in the middle of a?
You could. I mean, you can do like you can build your own GA. You can and the other things so we often have hybrid metaheuristics, and you can take the population that comes out of a MATLAB GA, for example, and use it as the initial population for another instance of a MATLAB GA with different hyperparameters. And people do that. So people often use a direct search method that's really exploration focused to a point, and then they stop, and then they take that population and they might plug it into a completely different algorithm that is much more exploitation focused, much more fine tuning. So the GA might get you in the neighborhood of the optimizer, but then you might just turn to gradient descent and you initialize it with whatever solutions came out of the GA, and then gradient descent will then crawl down the hill and fine tune for you. So you absolutely can stop these things early and then restart them with non-random populations from previous iterations. Other questions? All right, so let's look at some other operators then. So some time here. So those are the three selection operators. Usually one is defaulted in a GA algorithm, but you have the opportunity to switch to the others and change their hyperparameters or create your own. You say, I don't like any three of those selection operators. Let's say for your application, there's another reason why you want to I want to make sure that we're selecting these individuals based on this weird property that doesn't really get captured by fitness somehow. You can build your own selection operator. All that really matters is that you provide the next R parents or a probability of whether someone's going to be in that next parent. Like you have to fit the right interface for the selection operator for that algorithm, and then you write your own. It's totally fine. And the crossover operator is similar to that. So this is the default crossover behavior, is that after we have our R parents, so in book algorithm, they're part of the next population. In MATLAB, they're intermediates that are going to be used to build the next population. But after we have them, regardless of where they are, then we are going to select some of them to breed in pairs to produce two pairs of offspring. And we call that recombination. So we're going to say they recombine. So the crossover operator is going to basically take in two random parents, which I'm showing here as this is the genotype for one parent and the genotype for the other parent. And I've created a gap. I've created at gene K, I've just created a little fence in between there. So there's, in both parents, I'm focusing on genes 1 through K, and then I got a little gap, and then I focus on genes K plus 1 to N. And what crossover does, and we'll see this when I define them specifically here, is it keeps these in place and it swaps these two. So the two offspring that come out, they will look like the parents for everything before the crossover point, but then they'll be swapped for everything after the crossover. And we'll see numerically why you'd want to do that. What does that get you? Yeah.
Real quick about the selection of parents. How about choosing some of the worst parents and then mutating them aggressively?
You could
Explore the space.
That would almost be you're almost suggesting an alternative optimization meta-heuristic. So like if we want to be faithful to the genetic algorithm being a mimic of natural selection, we probably wouldn't want that characteristic to be a part of it. But if you thought, this could probably be a very exploratory way to do it, you could create your own optimization algorithm. Maybe it's just not named the genetic algorithm, even though it's maybe inspired by it. Or maybe what you're saying, it's like genetic algorithm with hypermutation or something like that. Like you could sort of name that, but you're almost suggesting a new mechanism that goes beyond these three mechanisms, selection, crossover, and mutation, to generate innovation. And so these three mechanisms are based on high fitness and making use of them and then perturbing that a little bit. And you're sort of suggesting a third mechanism, which is saying, like, in order to get maximal diversity, it's almost like, we've got individuals that, it's almost like there's a sexual selection maybe where you're selecting for novelty. Like there might be somebody who's not doing that well over there, but they end up getting recombined with someone that is doing well, modeling this idea that oh yeah, that person, even though they've got low fitness, in terms of absolute fitness, they might have high selective or high sexual attraction because they're novel or something. So you could come up with some narrative, but you absolutely could come up with other ways to introduce novelty in these populations. These are just the standard ways that are kind of mimicking biological processes. All right, so MATLAB has this crossover fraction that I mentioned before, where it says, I have m minus e slots left over. This is the fraction of them that I am going to fill with crossover. So in the R parents that are out there that we've just selected, then I'm going to randomly draw two of them, run them into crossover, and that will produce two, and then those will go into my crossover fraction. And I'm going to do that over and over and over again until I fill up my crossover fraction. Now, you might end up producing more offspring than you need, one more than you need, and then you just discard that one. Like if this crossover fraction gives you, I need to fill up 7 slots, and you produce, well, then eventually you're going to produce an even number of offspring because you always produce 2 offspring. Then once you hit 7, then you just randomly throw away one of those offspring. So you do on that edge case. In the other route, the book genetic algorithm, then they produce the non-parents this way with crossover. Same deal. They have the parent population. They draw 2 randomly. Those 2 random individuals go through this crossover process, produce 2 offspring, and then those 2 offspring go into the back half of that population. So we're going to talk about how to build these crossovers, but these are how you use them in these 2 different algorithms. But the actual module, the crossover module, looks the same. So just like with selection, there's different ways we can do crossover. The simplest version of crossover is 1-point crossover. And so these, by the way, these are simulating things that go on during meiosis, during the production of gametes. And so every cell of your body has got, every somatic cell of your body, except for red blood cells, has got 2 copies of every chromosome. So to produce new chromosomes, that go into the sex cells, that go into sperm and egg, then those 2 individuals, one that came from mom, one that came from dad, those 2 chromosomes, those then come together and they get crossed over in this particular way. Now to produce sex cells, then they get split so that this chromosome goes off and becomes, and this chromosome, they become separate haploid cells with only 1 set of chromosomes. Those are how you get eggs and sperm. We don't split things up here. These are, we always, remember, I guess things are always split. So we are a diploid organism. We have 2 sets of chromosomes, and we happen to produce haploid eggs and sperm. In the GA, all the organisms are haploid. So there's none of that splitting. So it is sex-like, but it definitely diverges quite a lot from biological sex. But that's the idea, is I've got 2 individuals, they only have 1 set of genes, so they come together, and the offspring end up sharing the first half of their genes and swapping the second half. And the fence post that separates that is chosen randomly. So you have your 2 individuals come in, and at that point, you draw a random gene number. So you have N genes. So I guess I should, as a reminder here, we have N genes. So N locations in this direction. And we're picking a random gene to serve as the fence post, where everything before that gene stays the same, and everything after that gene gets swapped from the other individual. And that's 1 point crossover. Does that make sense? So two parents come in and then two offspring go out looking similar to the parents, but their back halves have been exchanged. Now, this isn't the only way you could do crossover. You can do 2 point crossover. So same process, but instead of choosing one gene as your fence post, you choose two simultaneously. So you might say, instead of, so gene 6 and gene 10. And the way you then do that is you kind of alternate when you keep and when you swap. So with only 2 point crossover, the middle section gets swapped and the outer two sections stay the same. And that's how you produce your two offspring. And then you can take that to the extreme, and this isn't quite the extreme, but you can imagine 3, 4, 5, any height, so you can imagine more and more of this crossover where all of the even segments, so I could call this segment 1, this segment 2, and this segment 3, and if I kept this going, 4, 5, 6, and so on, and all of the even segments are where the swapping happens, and all the odd segments are left alone. So that would be, and you could imagine writing algorithms that make it easy to do this. So that's multi-point crossover. And then really the extreme case is this, it's almost qualitatively different, uniform crossover. And so in uniform crossover, we define a separate hyperparameter, which is the probability of crossover at any particular gene. And so here you walk down through all n genes, and then you flip a coin. And you say, so this is parent 1, this is parent 2. To produce the offspring, you walk to this location, and you say, do I swap these two? And if that coin comes up heads, then you swap them, and Y goes into this offspring, and X goes into this offspring. But if it comes up tails, you leave them in the same order that they are, and you do that for every gene. And that's uniform crossover. So it has the maximal chance of reassorting alleles. You can see in these ones, you do get reassortment that if you're at the back end, so it's a very good chance. Like if you had an allele here and an allele here, then crossover very likely is going to separate those two. So alleles for this gene are not going to be associated with, not going to correlate with the location of alleles of this gene. So crossover is very likely to put a fence between them so that they are free to move around. But if you happen to be two alleles that are right next to each other, then you would need the crossover point to be drawn right in between you in order to be separated. So that is what crossover breaks up, what we call a linkage. So if you store things on a string, then you can have alleles that sort of ride the coattails of other alleles. Crossover breaks them up by swapping alleles within the gene, within the chromosomes. But still, you have a greater chance of breaking up linkage if the alleles are at separate sides of the chromosome than if they're right next to each other. So that's the pointwise version way we implement crossover. Any questions about that? Okay, so there's one other way we can implement crossover, and it comes from thinking about, well, we'll see. You have to think about what crossover is doing, and I'll show that in the next slide. But let me just define this as that a more efficient, computationally efficient way to implement crossover is to do it mathematically rather than swapping things in a data structure. So what we can do is draw a random number between 0 and 1, and then create two offspring, which are linear combinations or convex combinations, because it's between 0 and 1 here, of the two parents. So now we've got the whole vector for offspring 1, which is just the whole vector for offspring for parent 1 and the whole vector for parent 2 that are being weighted against each other. So it's like the offspring are weighted averages of parents where the weighting is drawn randomly. So if this alpha is very close to 0, then offspring 1 is going to look just like offspring 2. And offspring 2 is going to look just like offspring 1. If this alpha is very close to 1, we get the flip. So if it's very close to 1, offspring 1 looks like parent 1, and offspring 2 looks like parent 2. If they're anywhere in between, it kind of interpolates between the two parents. And so that's the idea here, is that offspring are random interpolations between parents. And if you allow alpha to become negative or greater than 1, then it even allows for extrapolations. So if, so you can imagine that, all of these parents are going to be, or these offspring are going to be in between these parents because the mixture is from 0 to 1. But if you allowed this to be, 1.5, then now you're mixing these things where offspring 1 can be kind of like an amplified version of parent 1, subtracting off pieces of parent 2. So it becomes, it's outside of the cone. Like this is like a conical combination. So it defines a cone between two parents. Once you break the 0 to 1 constraint, then it allows you to move outside of that conical combination. So, so that's a mathematical way to do. Now, how is this crossover? Well, if we think about crossover, well, let's think about what's going on here for one. This is our linear version of implementing crossover. If we have our so-called fitness landscape, so I've got my genotypes on the x-axis, so now I'm considering my genotype as just a scalar. So it's a boring problem. And on the y-axis, I don't have my optimization objective, I have my fitness function. So that's what we call as a fitness landscape. And I might have multiple fitness peaks. And so I have a peak here, a peak here, a peak here. Now it might just be that parent 1, let's call it mom, is on this peak, and parent 2 is on dad on this peak. Now, if I take random combinations of these two parents, then I might get one offspring that happens to be in between the two of them. Like that's where this weighted average ended up being. And this is a valley. This is a spot that is not very good in terms of fitness. But this one manages to find this intermediate peak that just happened to be positioned in between them. So one of the things that this is doing is it's allowing us to cross these so-called adaptive valleys. The thought here is if selective pressure is moving you uphill, how do you ever explore another fitness peak that you don't have an individual on? This is a major problem. And recombination allows you to tunnel through this adaptive valley. So even though selection is pushing you uphill, recombination allows you to suddenly pop up to another hill that selection wouldn't have allowed you to move down to find this hill. So that's why this could be good, this crossing this adaptive valleys here. So we're crossing from here, we recombine these two, and then maybe end up finding ourselves on this hill. And once you've got one member on this hill, then natural selection can push you up the hill to find higher and higher points on that hill. That's potentially the reason we like recombination. But how is this recombination? This looks more like recombination in the biological sense. Well, this gives us an idea of what's going on in the biological sense. Let's say our genotype were the places of these, like this is our X value for parent 1, and our genes are the places of this number, different place values of this number. If these are my two parents and I decide to split them here, recombination is going to keep these higher place values, these most significant bits, and swap the least significant bits. Well, notice what happened there. After recombination, these two offspring are in between these two parents. So that's done exactly what our linear combination did with an alpha between 0 and 1. It created an intermediate or an interpolated version of the parents. Now, if I just happen to take the exact same parents, but move the crossover point to here, then now I keep this most significant bit, but I swap all of the decimals. And at this point, 5.6 is actually outside and 0.02 is outside. So now the offspring are beyond the parents. So what we think mathematically is going on when you do these swaps inside the crossover, inside this string, is pretty much what we're modeling here. So that's one reason we justify that sometimes this, which is much easier to implement in a computer, gives us all the benefits of this, because we think that's what's going on with this. And I'll talk next time, I'll finish this up with other interesting things that happen with crossover as the dynamics go on, but I think this is probably a good place to stop here. So crossover and its model as a linear combination of parents. All right, so if there are any, I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, so if there are questions, feel free to come up. Otherwise, I am going to push, because we didn't get through mutation, I'm going to push by at least a couple of days, at least 3 days, the concept check and the mini project. So they were due on Sundays, this Sunday and next Sunday. I will push them at least to Wednesday and next Wednesday. All right, but the money's point is still do this. All right, so we'll see you next week. And any questions, feel free to come up.